Please welcome Semafor CEO and co-founder Justin B. Smith.
Good morning. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Gallup Great Hall. This is we at Semafor are very, very privileged to call this building and this wonderful Great Hall our home of sorts. Thanks to Jim Clifton, the chairman and founder of Gallup, and John Clifton and the whole team, who embraced Semafor's mission early on and invited us here to work with them. My name is Justin Smith. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Semafor. We are indeed the world's fastest growing independent news platform. Only 20 months old now, or just over 20 months old. We have built an amazing team of journalists and publishers and commercial folks across America, across Africa, where we have a Semafor Africa regional edition with 16 journalists, and also we'll soon be launching in the Middle East, in the Gulf, which is something which we are going to be, we're very excited about. Our plan over time is to cover the whole world, but we can't get there right away, so we're starting region by region. And our mission since founding is to provide global leaders like all of you with intelligent, independent, and transparent journalism in what is, as you all know, an increasingly polarized news environment. So we're experts across 4 different government agencies, the Senate and the White House. And of course, quality journalism is expensive and a big investment. So a big thank you to our partners and friends at Verizon Business for supporting today's event. We would not be here without them. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, who has long been on the forefront of cybersecurity issues in the Senate. Thank you all again for joining us again today. Let's get to the news.
Please welcome Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. Joining the senator on stage is Semafor's Deputy Washington Bureau Chief, Morgan Chalfant.
Senator Wyden, thank you so much for being at this event, and great crowd today.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to jump right in with a topic that you've been really interested in recently, which is privacy practices of automakers that are making connected vehicles. Can you give us a status update on your investigation?
The car saga really goes all the way back to 2022 when we saw the draft opinion in Dobbs, leaked, and we were all sitting on our iPads and reading it. And it was clear to me then that women were going to have their personal data weaponized against them. And it was also clear that the car, bad pun, was going to be the vehicle, for doing it, because we had had problems over the years trying to protect people's, privacy with respect to all this data and with the sensors and the computers and everything with cars. And it was clear that it was going to be a problem. And Markey and I started the investigation, and it continues to this day.
And what have you found primarily, and kind of where are you looking to take that investigation?
Well, I'm particularly troubled that the car companies lied with respect to whether or not they were going to comply with the requirement that they only give data to law enforcement, when there was a warrant, particularly location, data. We saw, earlier this year, Planned Parenthood facilities, had, hundreds of them give up, in effect, their location data. People got it. They didn't give it up voluntarily. So this is a big problem. It's a national security problem. Mm-hmm. And, we're also looking at this area of car companies selling data to insurance companies because, again, the car companies make $50,000 on a car, and then they want to try to wring some pennies out of, people by selling their data to data brokers and all kinds of sleazy people.
Mm-hmm. And have you been satisfied with are you getting information from the car companies? Are they actually cooperating with the investigation?
We're doing it by putting them under the spotlight. For example, Ford, essentially, when we started asking questions, changed their policy and decided to only give up the data to law enforcement when they had a warrant.
Mm-hmm. Great. And another area where you've been really focused is healthcare, cybersecurity of the healthcare industry. Obviously, we've seen ransomware attacks, targeting the healthcare sector. You've been really pushing the administration to do more to force the hand of the healthcare sector to do more on cyber. What kind of feedback have you been getting from the Biden administration on some of your criticism of what they've done?
They are moving. There's no question about it. But people need to see this as a four-alarm fire, and they need to go faster. Our inquiry into UHG in particular, that was a classic example of flunking cybersecurity, 101. They didn't do the work up front, which is multi-factor authentication. Then they weren't prepared for problems, which essentially is redundancy. And their exec basically, showed up and didn't really seem to understand the significance of how important it was that they didn't even have multi-factor on their first server. This is just the basics of cybersecurity, and now we're playing catch-up ball. The Bush administration, I think, was one of the last to do anything, early in the century, and this makes healthcare facilities a prime target for bad guys who are trying to take advantage of technology to hurt people.
And do you feel like the Biden administration is hearing your calls for, doing more on this area? Do you see progress?
They are doing better, but the process, and it's got to be sped up. They're talking about having this ready to go at the end of the year. That's not soon enough. Today, as we sit here, there is no question that this is a prime target for people who want to take advantage of us.
And why do you think the healthcare sector is so vulnerable? Is it just because the stakes are so high, because lives are at risk? Are there other reasons?
It's a combination, the stakes being very high, and also a whole lot of foot dragging for several decades. There hadn't been an audit, since 2017. There haven't been real changes since the beginning of the century. So you have the intersection of the stakes being very high and the fact that the last 15 years there's been a lot of foot dragging, and the Biden administration, to their credit, are now moving, but they have to speed it up.
And obviously, this is one sector in a very broader network of critical infrastructure. The government's very focused on cybersecurity there. Are there other sectors that you're particularly worried about when it comes to just lax defenses in the cyber realm?
Well, I want to make sure now, with the coming of AI, that people don't just pretend, well, AI is going to take care of everything. You've got to take care of cybersecurity specifically, and that's what we saw with Microsoft's problem with recall.
And I'm glad you mentioned AI, because I did want to ask about that. On balance, does it make us more secure or less secure? Do you see benefits to AI in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, I've introduced what I think is the foundational bill with respect to AI, and a big chunk of the chairs in the United States Senate are now co-sponsors. It's called the Algorithm Accountability Act, and it goes to people's credit and education and housing, and it protects their essentials with a lot more transparency and accountability. We're going to talk about all kinds of exotic things with respect to AI. I say start with the basics, and our Algorithm Accountability Act, Senator Booker is the lead sponsor with me in the Senate, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, a leader in the House on these issues, and I think that's the foundational bill.
Now, I want to shift a little bit to the election, election
Is there an
security.
election coming up? Folks, did I hear a rumor that there's an election coming up? Oh my God, I hadn't got that official.
So you're on the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is obviously very focused on potential foreign interference and what the federal government is doing to address that. Are you satisfied with what the federal government has been doing to secure the election and also address foreign influence, foreign interference efforts?
There is clearly more to do, and I've been zeroed in on the follow the money issues. For example, at our open intelligence hearing, we don't have very many. I asked questions about Donald Trump and his relationship with the Saudis and the like. So all of those issues are areas where you follow, and Avril Haines made it clear in response to my question that they were going to put a lot of focus on it. I do think that when you have the leader of a major political party talking about the prospect of violence and intimidation and the like, if you vote, that's more serious than a bunch of foreign trolls trying to, get some visibility with a meme.
So you're actually more worried about the physical threats right now than you are about kind of the...
I'm on the Intelligence Committee. I think I'm going to leave it at that. But there are plenty of them.
Are there, which nation are you most worried about? Is it the Russians, or, are you, what about the Chinese?
If you're on the Intelligence Committee, my older child often calls up and says, "So, Dad, what's going on the so-called Intelligence Committee?" And, you can't get into it. I think there are very significant challenges with respect to the security of our elections. I mentioned one that I asked about in an open hearing, which concerns me very much because historically, if you follow the money, you can lead yourself to some of the big issues. But I do think that this pattern, particularly with the Republican Party candidate, constantly talking about intimidation and violence and the like. He lied about vote by mail. I'm the nation's first senator elected completely by mail. Donald Trump said people have big parties and they all fill out each other's ballots. That is just false.
Mm-hmm. And are there things that you think the federal government can do better in terms of preparing for potential interference or influence? Obviously, there's several different agencies involved in this. You have DNI, you have CISA.
You have the alphabet soup. I've said that more than anything, it's important to level with the public early. Mm-hmm. And this is a part of a significant debate because if you level with them early, are you getting people rattled and scared, and is it really warranted? And there's a balance to be found there, and we have to do a better job of it.
Do you have a sense of kind of which side the government will lean more on? Is it more about disclosing and being public, or is it more about kind of being reserved in terms of what they share?
I hope it will be the former. I think people have a right to know, and I think you can communicate with them in a thoughtful, straightforward way, and that's why I'm so concerned about all these accounts of intimidation and violence, and if we don't win, people are going to do thus and so. That's not in the public interest.
And one more question on this, a subject that Mark Warner has focused on a lot has been the engagement with social media companies or lack thereof. Are you satisfied right now with kind of the engagement between the federal government and social media companies when it comes to election influence campaigns?
I sit next to Senator Warner on the Intelligence Committee. He's on the Finance Committee, so we talk a lot more about it. Look, the social media companies can do significantly better in almost everything. For example, I'm the author of Section 230, the big major tech bill that said the individual is accountable rather than the platform for something that's posted. The tech companies are not doing everything they need to get the garbage off their platform. So whether it's elections, whether it's monitoring their platforms, there's not an area where they can't do more. And they better recognize that people are going to say there's real problems out here, and you get a choice. You can step up voluntarily, or you may not like some of the government prescriptions.
Is there one company that's kind of most at fault there? I mean, TikTok was named in the Senate or in the Intel Committee.
It's not an atomic secret that I've been very troubled by Microsoft's practices in cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. We go back to the SolarWinds issue. I mean, there are a whole host of practices, and they didn't do basic prevention work. Look, cybersecurity, and I think you're going to have a wonderful program, and I'm looking forward to, getting a download on all the things you go into. It's very difficult, but the concepts are pretty straightforward. You've got to do basic prevention. You asked about healthcare. Healthcare was not requiring multi-factor authentication. That's the problem, UHG. So you do prevention, but then you've got to be out there ready to help people pick up the pieces, which is redundancy, and UHG and others haven't done that.
Now, it is an election year, and work on Capitol Hill tends to kind of grind a little bit to a halt when there's a big election going on. What's your cybersecurity priority that you think can be achieved by the end of this Congress?
Well, we've talked about healthcare and elections being key, but since I've got such an influential group here, let me bring up also that I think it's time to pass the Smith-Wyden tax bill. He is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House. I chair the Senate Finance Committee. It passed by 357 votes in the House. You can't get 357 votes, folks, in the House of Representatives to order a piece of apple pie. And this is a chance to help 16 million vulnerable kids with the child tax credit. We got 4 million small businesses that need research and development, folks who need low-income housing, folks who have to get on their feet after a disaster. That's a special priority of mine between now and the recess for August.
Yeah, and there was some reporting recently about vulnerable Senate Democrats pushing Schumer to put that on the floor. Do you think he will?
We've been talking a lot about it. He and I came to the Congress together. I think the issue with respect to the tax bill is when it gets on the floor, we're going to get the votes, and I expect that.
And one more question on cyber. Obviously, it's been an area of bipartisan cooperation. Do you see there being a big shift in that cooperation if there is a change in administration next year?
I would hope not. I mean, you look at technology and historically the most important work. I mean, when we were dealing with 230, I showed up in the United States Senate. And essentially, the only person who knew how to use a computer was Pat Leahy. Literally, one person knew how to use a computer. And I got to write with Republicans these foundational laws, not just 230, but Spence Abraham, you may not know him, he's from Michigan. He and I wrote the digital signatures bill. Used to plan to spend hours a day at some real estate office. Now you click a few times and you're done. So I think apropos of the good work Semafor is doing, and we had a good visit outside, I think you've got a chance to really drive this debate in a thoughtful sort of way. And I think, other than some of these election issues, I haven't even mentioned the word Republican. The best work in the tech space has been bipartisan.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Senator
you for your
Wyden,
help.
for the time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Please welcome Chris Bowen, founder and CISO at ClearData, Brian Mazanek, Deputy Director of the Office of Preparedness at the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And joining remotely is Nathan Lesser, CISO at Children's National Hospital. Semafor Senior Editor Gina Chong will moderate this conversation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to our panelists for this important topic, especially focusing on a sector that is so important to all of us, the healthcare sector, where attacks on their networks could be a literal life and death issue. So I'm really eager to dive in and have some words of wisdom, hopefully, from all of you. And I wanted to start off with the United Healthcare attack. For those of you who weren't following, though I know a lot of you were, this was an attack on our healthcare industry, the biggest insurer in the country, and it affected basically a third of Americans. And the attackers basically got what they wanted. It was a ransomware attack. They got $22 million, and since then we've seen ransomware attacks, particularly on the healthcare sector, tick up. So with that not so positive backdrop, Chris, I wanted to start with you and get a sense of lessons learned from this. I mean, can something good actually come out of this?
Yeah, let's use MFA. How's that?
Yeah.
Let's start
That's
with that.
multi-factor authentication.
Right,
that's how the attackers got in.
Yeah.
Very simple defense there.
Well, I mean, you had a credential that was compromised. So some of the HIPAA basics come into play here. System activity review, IAM, identity and access management. That's something that we see customers, and by the way, we do only healthcare, cloud technology, and cybersecurity. That's where a lot of organizations fall short. They forget to get the keys out, they forget to rotate their passwords, they forget to do some of these basic hygiene types of things, and then you wonder why something like this could happen.
So they basically make it easy for attackers to penetrate.
It's like teeing it up with a beach ball.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, Brian, for you, coming from the government, from Health and Human Services, How do you help the private sector in this
Yeah.
space? And do you feel like you could be doing a lot more?
No, great question, Gina, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So at the Department of Health and Human Services, we've been really concerned for over the past year at the increasing sophistication, severity of the ransomware attacks on the healthcare sector. As Chris kind of hit on it, but I think just the complexity of the sector, the legacy devices, a lot of converging factors make it an easy target, frankly, and we've been sounding the alarm for some time. The department rolled out, working with our friends and partners in industry very closely, we rolled out a new strategy to deal with this threat in December, which I'm happy to go into in more detail, but we've been turbocharging those efforts in light of the Change Healthcare attack, the Ascension attack, just seeing the increasing frequency and sophistication of these threats. But we offer a lot of tools and resources for industry. We have something called the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices, the HICCUP, that we developed with industry to provide very robust sort of guideposts and reference documents for particularly those small rural hospitals, the hospitals and parts of the healthcare ecosystem that have really narrow margins for a lot of reasons unrelated to cyber, and maybe their CISO or their cyber IT folks it's their third or fourth job. So we're providing simple resources to support them, but our strategy that we rolled out in December calls for more, and the president's budget had a $1.3 billion program in it for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to really drive resources into the sector as well, which we think is important.
Yeah. And Nathan, for you at Children's National Hospital, which I'm sure a lot of you in the audience know, I know my daughter has gone there, you're in the trenches. So how did you guys view this ransomware attack, and did it make you rethink some of your defenses and strategies?
Of course, and thank you for having me. I think it's important to note that from our perspective, Change Health wasn't just another ransomware attack. It was a black swan event. It was one that indicated and sort of helped us to understand the underlying fragility of our system. We think of attacks on hospitals today as events that unfortunately more often than not cause degraded service in terms of systems for weeks, sometimes more than a month. And that's bad enough. But when we think about what we often deem third-party or fourth-party risk, how does an attack on a supplier to us or a supplier to our suppliers affect our environment? It's something that we're very concerned about, and often we don't have visibility into. But the Change Health breach was one that went even a step further because, and I'm loath to get too technical here, but the way payments are processed for healthcare organizations is not directly from the delivery organization, a hospital, to the payment payer, to the insurance company. We go through these clearinghouses. So a hospital goes to a clearinghouse and they're supposed to send the claim to a payer or an insurance company. In this case, it's even more complicated. Change Health had exclusive relationships with some of the payers, with some of the insurance companies, so that even though an organization like Children's National that didn't use Change Health as our clearinghouse had to go to Change Health in some instances in order to get to that insurance company that had an exclusive relationship with Change. So imagine how it is, how we must have to think about mitigating the risk. We don't have any relationship with Change Health. We have no contract. We have no mechanism through which we can force them to adhere to our security practices and standards. And yet we are affected to the tune of a significant amount of top-line revenue when it comes to our ability to process claims for our patients.
So, Chris, with that context, what do you tell your clients when they're faced with this kind of situation? Just as we had talked about, these can be life and death issues. I mean, if you shut down a hospital, you have patients who could be in serious trouble. So what are they supposed to do in that kind of situation?
Boy, I wish I had the answer to that. I'd be a very rich man. It's a challenge. Honestly, it's very, very difficult to control the behemoth. Let's just call United Health the behemoth here. They don't care. I mean, they obviously they care now.
Yeah.
But when they have those exclusive relationships and you can't do anything to influence their behavior, their resiliency, you can't even ask for a SOC 2 report without having a whole big challenge of why do you need this? You're nobody to us. So when I first saw this breach happen, I live in Scottsdale. One of my former colleagues called and said, "Hey, we're down hard." This was hours after it happened, and I'll tell you what, it was calamity across our country. I initially thought there has to be some kind of, and I'm a libertarian by nature, but there has to be some kind of standard that says you can't put all your eggs in one basket, healthcare sector. That was a massive failure structurally.
Yeah.
And so I would hope that HHS come in, especially in your role, Brian, and say, we shall not put all of our eggs in that one basket. We need to decentralize some of this stuff to make it more resilient.
Absolutely.
Is that part of some of the game plan?
So that is part of our strategy. So I mentioned we rolled out in December, our new roadmap has 4 pillars. The first was, which we expedited, was the publication of voluntary healthcare-specific cybersecurity performance goals, which I would note includes MFA, which was an issue, obviously, in change, as
But
well.
should it be voluntary
Yeah,
at
well,
this point?
so-
Should it be?
I'll get to that in a moment.
Heavens
But it also included an element focused on third-party risk and systemic risk from a resiliency perspective. And they're built around the idea of protecting patient health and safety. That's our paramount concern. But the other pillars, one of the other pillars is focused on accountability and enforcement. And we're in the process now, we've talked about it a little bit publicly, of updating the HIPAA security rule and looking at other levers the department may have to drive those kind of practices that are embodied right now in the voluntary CPGs across the sector. So we absolutely recognize more needs to be done from a mandatory minimum standard perspective. That's consistent with the President's National Cyber Strategy, and we're pushing as quickly as we can in that direction.
Yeah. And Nathan, for you, what do you think should be done to try to, to the extent that you can, try to prevent or mitigate these kinds of situations? What do you need sort of forced upon your hospital to ensure, and the healthcare industry writ large, to help ensure that these kinds of attacks aren't so massive? And to Chris's point, should they be decentralized? Because United Healthcare was basically like a single point of failure. They were kind of the too big to fail in the healthcare industry, and we've seen the ramifications to that.
Right, so I think it's a very good point, and there are a lot of great questions in what you just asked. I don't think that United Healthcare is an example of something that hospitals or providers could have done anything about. I do think, and I agree
You were
with Chris,
just stuck, basically.
to a very large degree, yes. And I think that Brian and his team are doing great work. Chris Garcia, the Health Sector Coordinating Council, they're looking at other places of single points of failure in the system, systemic failure in our system, and we need to get ahead of it. This is, as bad as Change Health was, it didn't bring down the system. It could have. It really could have. And I think
And what do you exactly mean when you say it could have brought down the system?
We saw insolvency happen in individual point organizations, individual practitioners' offices, small practices. In one case in Oregon, I think insolvency of a small hospital.
Because they couldn't get paid. Is that
right? But we didn't see across the entire system. We didn't see hospitals failing to make payroll. We did see a lot of hospitals. This I think largely isn't public, so I won't name names. But we did see a lot of hospitals draw down on their credit line and effectively take a loan in order to float insurance companies. Now, I think that's something that the system is working its way through and trying to equalize. But boy, that's a really, if you think about who makes money in healthcare, it's really hard to envision a nonprofit hospital system taking a loan in order to float an insurance company. That said, there are things that we can improve in in hospital cybersecurity. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done there. We need help. I mean, I'll just say it, straight out. I feel like I am one of the luckiest CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers in healthcare. I have fantastic support from my executive leadership and my board of directors. They're very astute. They're very smart. They're very thoughtful. They ask me very hard questions. And I think we do a really good job. It does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that we aren't subject to the same kinds of attacks that have happened across the rest of healthcare, but we have to get out ahead of the curve. And you talked about how do you deal with it. We need to get a lot better at response and recovery. We need to get a lot better at shortening the time from a successful attack, especially a ransomware attack, to getting our system back online, recovering, and being able to operate at full capacity. And we need help. We need help. I mean, there's opportunities for the government to get engaged here and help us out.
Well, and we're basically out of time, but before we leave, Chris and Brian, I wanted you to just, in a single sentence, what's the best thing that you think firms in the healthcare industry could do to mitigate this? Is it really just taking care of the basics? Because that's really how we're seeing a lot of these attackers get in.
It's Larry in the basement clicking on things. It's hygiene. It's getting rid of end of life. It's the hygiene stuff. And I'll just finish by saying, we're never going to stop these people until the pain of the perpetrator is greater than the gain that they're getting. So we have to have some kind of offensive that Australia is already doing, for example.
And make it worse for them.
Make it worse for the bad guys, right?
Yeah.
And Brian?
And I would just say, again, I mentioned them, but the healthcare-specific cybersecurity performance goals are the most high-impact, basic practices. Make sure there's 10 essential, 10 advanced. Make sure you've implemented those. And going forward, I think I agree with everyone here. More needs to be done, and we're trying to rise up to meet that threat and bring more resources to the sector to bolster cybersecurity. And resiliency is key too. That was hit on here, but you're never going to prevent all the points of entry and an attack. It's being able to recover quickly after one happens to protect patient health and safety.
Great. Well, we're hoping after what we've seen occur that you guys all get the help that you need. So thank you so much.
Please welcome Aaron Lacey, Deputy Assistant Secretary and Assistant Director for Cyber and Technology Security at the U.S. State Department, Brandon Pugh, Director of Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats for the R Street Institute, and Kate Conley, Senior Advisor at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Semafor's Deputy Washington Bureau Chief Morgan Chalfant returns to moderate this conversation.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to jump right in an attempt to make some news. Kate, I'd like to ask you about Elon Musk's recent tweet. He said that he called for the elimination of electronic voting machines due to risks of hacking. I want to get your response to this.
Jumping right in with the easy one. Thanks, Morgan. Well, good morning, and thank you so much for having this conversation and the opportunity to talk about this issue. And so before I get into the specific response, I do want to kind of lay the foundation, which I think is crucial to put this tweet and other comments just in context. Since 2016, when we saw Russia attempt to interfere with our democratic process and that electoral cycle, it was really a call to action and a wake-up moment, especially for the election stakeholder community with respect to the threat posed by cyber threats and foreign influence operations and what that means to this community. Subsequent to that, we had the designation of election infrastructure as critical infrastructure in January of 2017. And that's where you've really seen the increased role of the federal government in helping these stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I mean the state and local election officials who are charged with managing, administering, securing elections, as well as election vendors, so the companies who are designing these systems that are utilized, helping this community understand the cyber and physical threats and then take the necessary steps to mitigate against those threats. And so since 2016, I will tell you there has been tremendous work done across the board to ensure the security and integrity and resiliency of these systems because we know the threat is out there, regardless of the actor, whether it's a state-sponsored actor or a cyber criminal. And so when you look at things like the electronic systems that are used, especially when it comes to the vote casting or tabulating side, Like, there are tremendous, tremendous efforts put in place to ensure their security through air gapping, through penetration testing, through additional physical controls and significant access controls to, again, just ensure that these systems are secure. And then when you look at a place or a time like 2020, any place there was a close contest, you had paper records that could be audited and recounted. And again, this all goes into how when you approach election security, it's not about single systems or single solutions. It is truly a defense in-depth methodology that utilizes physical and cyber controls to ensure the security, integrity, and resiliency of the entire process. And so I think it's just super important to understand that full context, right? And how, again, this community has done so much over the years. And that's why going into 2024, we do have the highest degree of security for our election infrastructure than any other cycle. Like, the 2024 election cycle is more secure than any previous cycle. And that's because of the tremendous effort that's gone into this. But that being said, we're certainly not taking our eye off the ball, and this goes back to my colleagues and friends here today. We understand this is also the most complex threat landscape we've seen for an election cycle. And so while we are confident, we are not complacent, and we continue to work with election officials and the vendors to push the envelope on security.
And how big of a challenge is it in the communication side of this? You know, you're going up against people that are questioning the security, and how are you thinking about that going into the cycle?
Great question. So when you really talk to people, there's really tremendous trust at the state and local level. Like, people typically trust their local election official because, you know what, it's the same person they see at the supermarket or in the PTA meeting or at their kids' soccer games. Like, these are your neighbors. And so I think one of the most important things we're trying to really encourage this cycle is elevating and amplifying the voices of state and local election officials, because they are truly the authoritative source. And so many have gone through great lengths to increase transparency into the process. Because, to your point, Morgan, they actually have a very good story to tell. Like, the work they are doing is something that builds confidence in the American people. And so we want them to be out there and to tell that story more and more. And actually, as a testament to that, yesterday at CISA, we actually just released a guide for election officials and the media and other stakeholders in the community called Enhancing Election Security, or Enhancing Security of Election Infrastructure Through Communications, that tries to help election officials who may not have dedicated communication staff understand how they can effectively communicate to the public and how crucial that is, especially this year.
Now, I want to take a step back and kind of look at the broader threat landscape. Brandon, you know, what are you most worried about when it comes to looking at, you know, the foreign adversaries out there that are, you know, active in cyberspace? Which actor are you most worried about, and kind of what behavior?
Yeah, no, thanks for moderating today. I'd say, like, I wish we had an hour because there's so many different answers to this, but if I had to pick two that are probably closest to me, the one, promise, Senator White and I did not actually coordinate in advance, even though it's going to sound like it. It's probably the risk of adversaries collecting and exploiting data. Data and privacy implications are largely thought as traditionally just a consumer issue. Like, I don't care about what people are purchasing about me online or what my shopping habits are, but in the hands of adversaries, it can have devastating consequences. Everything from more effective disinformation campaigns to more effective cyber attacks and incidents to the opposite. It's just, we see even physical violence playing out in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So that is really a reality. And unfortunately, it's been raised multiple times by key level leaders, but there's been insufficient action. Yes, we have an executive order on the books now. The House and the Senate passed the bill looking at the data brokers aspect, but it only is a piece of the actual issue. There's still more that needs to be done. And then secondly, going back to local and counties. You know, I come from an elected official background, and I think local governments are still very unprepared for their cyber threats. CISA has done a great job in helping them. It's just, is a local township going to be able to go against a nation-state actor? They're lucky to have a director of technology. The concept of having a director of cybersecurity is really not there.
And Garen, I want to bring in you here because, you know, you have a really interesting role at state. You're in the trenches every day, you know, protecting U.S. embassies, classified data from cyber threats abroad. What keeps you up at night? What do you spend the most time on? What are you most worried about?
So what we're really focused on is the convergence of all technology used to come after our data. We see that convergence of physical, technical security, right? James Bond going into your embassy and planting bugs, that's still a thing. It still happens. and we're, of course, the cyber landscape from my point of view. What we see is that any adversarial activity, primarily the big four, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, there won't be isolated activities. You're not going to see just a cyber attack. You're going to see cyber with elements of human, with human intelligence, elements of technical, and elements of physical. So they're absolutely converging. And what we're working hard to make sure that we converge those skill sets, not just in the State Department, but across with our federal partners as well. I think the key there is knowing who's in that foxhole right next to you. From the foreign policy standpoint, we work extensively with our Five Eye partners, other foreign ministries, because we share the same types of skill sets, we see the same type of activity, and most importantly, we conduct the same type of activity overseas. So making sure that we are well aligned with our partners from a foreign policy perspective, but also make sure we're well aligned with folks in the federal government that do that same kind of work as well. Knowing who's next to you in the fight, knowing what they're looking for and seeing is critical. I may see things at my boundary that our environment is well positioned to protect against, but that same thing may be very, very valuable to a partner. And I need to be able to get that information to them quickly. Again, this is where we rely on our partners like CISA, where they've done an outstanding job of building that kind of connective tissue between the agencies. But at the same time, there has to be informal relationships with the practitioners. No one knows what a cyber defender needs like another cyber defender, right? No blue teamer knows what blue team needs like another blue team. So the better we can get aligned with our partners, the more we can understand their environments and how they're built, where their vulnerabilities are, the better we can shorten each other's learning curve in terms of, hey, your success is our challenge. Let's learn from you, the practitioner, how you've succeeded here, and we do the same for you to turn that collaboration into collective action.
Has your work become more difficult or more complicated as we've seen, conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine evolve, in the recent years?
Absolutely. We are at a convergence of a very unique time in history when it comes to protecting information. We have kinetic wars going on right now. You can say 2, some would say up to 6 or 7, depending on how you look at Africa and South America and things like that. But we also have a massive rise in the use of technology. So what we've seen, the adversaries that are already out there, the big 4 that we know of, they take the technology and use it as an amplifier to get better at what they do, right? But we've also seen a rise in hacktivism as well. And with the kind of crowdsourcing of threat intelligence, the hacktivism, the bar of entry for actual technical skill set that you need to be in this space is actually a lot lower. These adversaries, particularly the hacktivists, can crowdsource that information and now just raise the noise floor with all types of nuisance type activity. And one of the things that we've seen particularly distracting is we've seen adversaries utilizing AI, taking open source information, using AI to make that open source information look like an official document and claim a compromise to a network, to spin up the cyber defenders, when in actuality, that document was never on the network in the first place, and upon further examination, it's not even real. But now you have to sift through all of that additional noise, right? Which again, adds to the level of data that's coming in to your environment. All the more reason the partnerships across the board are so important so that we can all sift through that information together.
And I'm glad you mentioned AI because, Kate, I wanted to ask about your work and how AI is impacting what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, just given the proliferation of AI technology.
No, 100%, and this is a phenomenal tee-up. I think when we talk about the risk of generative AI to the 2024 election cycle in particular, we do not believe it's going to fundamentally introduce new risk to the 2024 cycle, but we do believe it's going to exacerbate some existing risks, right? So we talk about lowering the bar for nefarious actors to be able to leverage malicious cyber code. You don't need to know how to code anymore to leverage malware. That makes it easier for someone to try to leverage a cyber attack for their intents and purposes, whether criminal or otherwise. When you look at foreign influence operations and disinformation, the ability to make that synthetic whatever more compelling or more persuasive is absolutely there. But I love the parallel because this is exactly what we're saying too. The whack-a-mole strategies I think we've employed in the past when it comes to disinformation, it's not going to be effective given today's information environment. There's more platforms, there's more methods of distribution. We see migrations to not just social media platforms, but to chat channels. I think a lot of this really comes back down to helping the American people understand how to focus on the signal and ignore the noise. If you are looking for factual and accurate information about your elections process, turn to your state and local election official. Turn to the trusted, authoritative sources of that information to ensure you're getting the accurate information. But we are absolutely working with our partners, state and local officials, and election vendors who are very concerned about the exact examples you laid out. You know, I think the risk of something like a hack and leak that we've seen foreign adversaries use in the past, like Iran in the 2020 cycle, is absolutely higher this year. And I think that's where discussions like today are so important, because we need people to understand that this could happen. And we need to make sure people are resilient and, again, understand that just because you see it doesn't mean it's accurate, and to get to that authoritative source. I think in terms of how we're trying to help this community, going back to the value of partnerships, in January, the Director Easterly, myself, and the Secretary of State for Kansas, Scott Schwab, put out an article in Foreign Affairs talking about this. We put out a guide in January targeting the election officials with the tools that they can do to mitigate this risk. And then in April, we partnered with the Office of Director of National Intelligence and FBI to put out another piece on how to secure election infrastructure against the risks and the tactics of foreign malign influence operations.
Do you mind if I do a quick follow-up?
Yeah, of course.
No, I definitely agree with Kate. I think there are definitely risks and concerns around artificial intelligence. But I think something the government's done well is actually realizing the benefit side of it as well. I think adversaries are going to continue to use the technology for bad, no matter what guardrails we do in the US. I think that's an extraordinary opportunity now to use it to defend our networks and leverage it. And I know everybody in this room knows this. AI is not new. It's been interesting to see over the past 18 months the innovations to cybersecurity. But I think it's really important for local, county, and state governments especially to see if you're not leveraging AI, how can we do so? And then what's on the horizon? Try to get ahead of the technology landscape. I'm just really excited about it. But I say that not saying we shouldn't have any guardrails or safety considerations either. I think it is a healthy balance.
Well, we are out of time. I wish we had an hour too, Brandon. Thank you all so much for coming today, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome Chris Novak, Senior Director of Cybersecurity Consulting for Verizon Business. Joining him on stage is Jamie Lehman, Semafor's Global Head of Live Journalism Partnerships.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So as Chris knows, this is a very special opportunity for me. I have a very long-standing love and relationship for all things Verizon. And Chris has actually been with us a number of times, so I'm very honored to be able to have this conversation with you.
Always a pleasure.
All right, so we're going to jump right in. In the world of cybersecurity right now, eyes are all on the November election. Media reports are talking about how the bad actors are going to infiltrate, are going to have an impact. From your perspective, how real is that threat? And what do we have to be concerned about? And frankly, what can we do?
Yeah, so I think it's a very real threat, if not a near certainty, that there will be influence. I think we're already seeing that just based on the threat research that our team does today, we see influence campaigns already happening. And I think there's a couple of different ways that we ultimately see this play out. One is through things like misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So you affect what people are thinking in order to affect potentially how people will cast their ballot. Then the other concern is around the actual integrity and security of the actual voting infrastructure. What a lot of people often are surprised to understand is that much of that voting infrastructure in the United States is very decentralized. I'm in New York. The way that our systems work may be very different than they are in other places throughout the country. And that creates both an opportunity and a challenge in the sense of if it's all very different, in many cases that makes it somewhat harder to say we've uniformly applied security to it. At the same time, it also potentially adds the benefit of if it's all different, it makes it more challenging for a threat actor to be able to say, I'm going to target all of it because it's not necessarily all uniform. But again, there's a lot of pros and cons with it, and I think we're going to continue to see attacks both on the infrastructure and actual voting systems themselves, as well as it relates to the information or misinformation and disinformation campaigns.
So last month, Verizon issued its 17th edition of the Data Breach Investigation Report, otherwise known as DBIR. Right. I was looking through the report, and the thing that actually shocked me the most is despite the fact that Gen AI, clearly the hottest topic in tech these days, media reports are always speculating that it's playing a role, but in fact, the report found that it really hasn't had a profound impact. First of all, did that surprise you? And what do you see in terms of the future impact of Gen AI on the issue of cybersecurity?
Yeah, so I would say that surprised us a bit, and we actually had a lot of debate when we put the report together. Every year, we really base it on the evidence and what it is that we actually see happening out in the landscape. And when we put the report together, we generally only talk about things that we see as being meaningful and impactful. And we said, well, interestingly, when we look at the data, we see lots of people talking about Gen AI everywhere, and everyone here has probably used it. But in terms of actually being used to launch attacks, scale attacks, we're not actually seeing that happen in a meaningful way, which again, it did surprise us. And actually in the report, we put a chart that shows how often we see people generally talking about Gen AI, and that was literally almost off the chart high. But then actual association with threat actor usage and attacks kind of hovered across the bottom almost near zero. And I think the reality that we came to is this is a concern, and I think it will continue to scale. It will move up from zero. But what we see right now is that the threat actors are largely finding their existing and traditional methods continue to be extraordinarily successful. And generally speaking, they drive to change when something they do no longer works. A new defense blocks them, they have to innovate and evolve. And right now, I think just like everyone's general experiences with Gen AI today, sometimes it provides great results, sometimes it provides very erroneous or incorrect results. And so a lot of times if you're looking at it from a threat actor perspective, they've got some of what they do now down to kind of almost like an operational science. They go through the motions and they know how to go from one attack to the next. And so they're not necessarily seeing as much efficiency gain. But I do think it's something that we have to watch for the future. As it improves, just like it improves for us in terms of productivity, I think we're going to continue to see that threat actors will take interest in ways that they can scale it. The one exception I might say is around nation-state threat actors. They're the ones where I feel like we're probably going to see this being used earlier, sooner, faster because of the ability for them to actually invest in the infrastructure to build and train some of their own large language models to be leveraged like that.
So what is the answer to that? Obviously, Verizon Business, you consult with tremendous organizations, many of the organizations speaking today,
Sure.
Public, private sector. So what's the answer to that? What is the counsel that you give to your customers, to your clients, in terms of how to be prepared for those ongoing and emerging trends?
Sure. So I mean, one is, first, it's actually interesting in the report, one of the things we talked about was a lot of organizations' biggest risk from AI and generative AI is actually within their organization as opposed to external to it. So for the points I mentioned before, it's less likely someone's using AI to attack you. It's more likely someone internally is using a ChatGPT or a Gemini or something else, and what I would say kind of inappropriately or outside the company bounds, sharing information or conversing with it in a way that exposes sensitive intellectual property or confidential data. And so the first thing that we typically are recommending is some kind of really rigid or rigorous AI governance model to say, look, how is it that you're going to adopt and promote proper usage of it? Because the challenge we see is if you're not promoting an acceptable way, people will generally find an unacceptable way to get it done because they see it makes their job more efficient or it makes them more productive. So that AI governance model is an important way of addressing kind of that big internal risk. And then on the external risk, I think we're seeing a lot more in terms of evaluations we're doing and assessments we're doing with organizations today around their ability to leverage AI-driven tools for cyber defense, which I think is actually an area where we have a bit of a leg up in terms of the threat actors, as I mentioned. And so I think we're actually going to see continued improvements there where we're going to be able to leverage it to scale our security operations centers, our monitoring, our ability to analyze and crunch big data, and also look at things like threat intelligence.
Yeah. So Gen AI, definitely a future threat, but the landscape is changing. As you mentioned, the bad actors will innovate, will try new things. What were some of the major trends that you saw coming out of this year's report that you see that are different and unique, haven't happened before?
Yeah, so I would say one of the big things and probably most surprising was around things like exploitation of vulnerabilities. The concept of exploiting a vulnerability is obviously nothing new, but the rise that we saw, it was a threefold increase year on year, which it was actually, to us, was a very substantial increase. And so the big thing that we kind of took away from that was when we look at the vulnerabilities that were being exploited and the time it takes most organizations to address it, it was very elongated. So for example, if we looked at 55 days after a vulnerability has been known to the public, most organizations only had about half of them patched, which is obviously very concerning. Compare that to how quickly the threat actors are getting out there and scanning to find those vulnerabilities so they could exploit them. We found that was typically around 5 days. So compare 5 days, they're out there looking for it. 55 days, we only have half the problem patched. And so what we've started to have more conversations and dialogue with organizations about is things like cyber risk quantification, where we actually say, look at what your organization looks like. What are the systems you have? What are the applications? What is the data? Who are the users? And then how do you actually tag and quantify the risk associated with all of those? So when a new vulnerability comes out, you can actually assess and understand what the risk is. One, to say, how do you prioritize it? Because for a lot of organizations, nobody has, as far as I know, nobody has unlimited budget or unlimited resources. And the only way you're going to accelerate time is generally putting more resources or more money into the problem or better technology. And so we said, look, then it comes down to prioritizing. How do we ensure that the ones that actually create the biggest risk are addressed first, as opposed to just saying they all generally fall in this bucket and we'll get to it when we get to it? It might turn out the last one you get to should have been the first one you addressed. And so that's the kind of conversation. Then also that's helping to drive more of a mature conversation in the C-suite around things like preparation and budget. So for example, if the C-suite is having challenges or the CISO is having challenges getting budget to address some of the concerns, being able to actually tie a dollar figure to the risk. Hey, if this happens, this is what it might cost us. Because most of the C-suite and the board, they're really talking that language of risk. What's going to happen if we don't do this?
So in addition to being surprised that Gen AI isn't having the impact, I would say the other finding that really surprised me was that people still are. Despite the awareness, despite the education, I think the number was 68% of the attacks were due to human error. Did that surprise you? And what can you do to address what is purely human error resulting in these type of attacks?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'd say it probably stopped surprising me, and I don't know if that's a pessimistic view because I've been reviewing the data now for 17 years.
I promise it wasn't me.
The human element has been a challenge all of those 17 years, and I expect it to continue to be. It's coming down, but albeit it's coming down slowly. And so I think a key thing continues to be education and awareness, because what we find is people don't hear the message often enough. Our team goes out there and we investigate breaches for organizations of all sectors across all geographies, and we still run into the issue of we come down and find who user zero was, where the breach started, and we have an opportunity to speak to them about, hey, did you notice anything unusual? What did you see? And it's usually after that organization has suffered a massive breach and we've had that conversation that they'll say, well, actually, yeah, I did notice something was awry, but I didn't tell anybody. I thought somebody else saw it. So I think it's just a constant vigilance around those efforts.
Great. Well, Chris, thanks so much for being on our stage again. It was a pleasure as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Please welcome Justin Fear, SVP Red Team Operations at Darktrace, and John Davis, VP Public Sector for Palo Alto Networks. Author John Hilsenrath joins them on stage to moderate this conversation.
To moderate this panel, just so everyone understands the background of our experts. We have Justin, a former CIA operative, I don't know if that's the right word, and John ran cyber operations for the Pentagon for many years. So they bring a great level of expertise, and you have to listen very carefully, not just to what they say, but also to what they don't say. As a journalist, this is what I learned. So we're here to talk about the role of AI in cybersecurity. So I took the obvious bait on this panel and asked ChatGPT what to ask you both, okay? So the first question that ChatGPT had for you, John, was frankly, as a journalist, I found it to be a softball question, but we'll start with that and then we'll move from there. ChatGPT wants to know how Palo Alto Networks is using AI to enhance its cybersecurity function. And then just to add on to that, I told ChatGPT that was kind of too much of a softball and can I have a tougher question? And so they added on, and what are you doing to prevent abuse?
I like softball questions.
We're just getting started.
Yes. AI is a term that means a lot of different things to different people. And the way I view it, there's old AI and there's new AI. Mm-hmm. Old AI has been around for more than a decade. We've been using it at Palo Alto Networks in the form of machine learning. There's supervised machine learning and unsupervised machine learning. Supervised, you have to tell the algorithms what to look for. Unsupervised, you don't need to tell them because they have enough data to figure it out, and then they use automation to do whatever the function is. These capabilities, the old form, machine learning, have enabled the cybersecurity industry in general to move at speed and scale, and that's what's required to deal with modern cyber threats. So they're able to identify and stop many of the threats that have existed to this day. The new form of AI, generative AI, large language models, that's kind of new to the scene, only about a year or two where it's really caught fire. And that type of technology is really, I think, going to make it difficult to distinguish between fake and real. And that presents, now there are arguments about how good it is today, but that's going to give threats an advantage, especially when it comes to phishing and identifying fake from real. Things like ransomware, for example, that's going to give threats an advantage because it will enable people to make a mistake, click on the wrong link, and provide initial access to a network to do whatever it is they're designed to do. So at Palo Alto Networks, we are using 3 different forms of the new AI, securing it by design because you have to have accurate information, accurate data to take advantage of generative AI and large language models. We're embedding it in all of our various products across network, cloud, SOC automation, et cetera. And the most innovative thing is I think we're using it to improve the human-machine interface so that operators of cybersecurity technologies can leverage large language models to interface with those technologies and move faster, with more ease, and with more accuracy.
Who's moving faster, the aggressors or the defenders?
I think it's always going to be a race. It's always going to be action, reaction, counteraction. And so I think that the attackers are taking advantage of this. The defenders need to. If they're not taking advantage of these new capabilities, they're essentially bringing a knife to a gunfight, and they're going to lose. You got to bring a gun to a gunfight. You got to bring AI, automation, and advanced software-based analytics like machine learning, behavior analytics, big data analytics, deep learning, neural networking. All these capabilities will enable you to keep pace with and even, in my opinion, gain an advantage over attackers.
So Justin, you run the red team operations at Darktrace. Mm-hmm. Just tell us what a red team does. Sure. And walk us through kind of how you simulate attacks to prepare for actual events.
Yeah, so red teaming comes out of the US military, actually. It's essentially wargaming. You've got your red team, which is the attackers, and the blue team, which is the defenders. And our job's to win. So our job is to get in and get out covertly, but ultimately test the entire business, not just cybersecurity, but the entire business all the way from human process level all the way down to the technology, and find areas for vulnerabilities and gaps. So I get paid to break into Darktrace on a daily basis. And that could be going to the building in the middle of the night and picking door locks to try to test our physical security, all the way to a simulated ransomware attack that could take months on end.
So you're doing red teaming just internally at Darktrace, not for customers or other companies? Correct. Do they like you in the office?
No, not at all. No, we are not a liked team, but what I attempt to tell folks is working a red team for a cybersecurity company is more frustrating than not because I'm going up against our own product. And everything we find goes right back into our product. So if we find where we need additional visibility or we find the threat actors are currently doing something and we need to tweak some of the models, we work very closely with our dev, not just our internal security team.
How big is your team?
2 people.
2 people. Because I was going to ask you, like, if you have to be careful about who you bring on and who you let go, because they're learning these skill sets that could be turned to pretty malevolent forces.
Well, anybody can learn this. I mean, fire up YouTube and you could learn any of this. And I'd also say with large language models now, the barrier to entry is a lot lower. You can ask the large language model how to do something, and it gives you very concrete, explicit directions how to do it. So anybody could do it, but we've got some of the best folks in the industry, you know, a lot of former Intel agencies that bring different tradecraft to the business that we can kind of, you know, throw at the fire.
So how is AI, I'll ask this of both of you, changing the game for the defender and for the aggressor? How are aggressors using artificial intelligence, large language models to change the game of cyber attacks? And how are you employing it in newer, different ways?
So I'll just say I'm not as bullish on large language models and Gen AI as the rest of the industry is. I think it's fascinating. I think it's amazing. I think there's more hype than concrete evidence right now. Doesn't mean we're not going to get there and prove some of that hype wrong, but we're not there yet. That being said, our adversary is using it 100%. And I think the biggest area is data mining and just finding those patterns that humans just can't simply do. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that barrier to entry. Criminal organizations that might not have known how to do something or do something can execute a lot quicker. The one argument I'd make to a lot of folks is they don't need to use it right now. So if there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, then don't. And unfortunately, in our industry, folks are still clicking the link. So I don't see a mad rush by the criminal organizations using it. I do think nation state, I think it's safe to say, is probably already very much using it in various different shapes and forms.
John?
Yeah, John, I think that from a threat perspective, AI is enabling the threat to advance their tradecraft, to avoid detection, to hide their indicators of compromise, and to discover and exploit weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So I think that's the advantage it's giving threats. And I think it's going to get better and better as time goes by. May not be great right now, and as I said before, it's going to enable them to confuse reality with things that are not real. From a defender perspective, these technologies, AI technologies, are going to enable defenders to leverage, threats can hide in tremendous volumes of data. These technologies will enable defenders to discover, I think, at scale and at speed, threats that are hiding in these big volumes of data.
Faster and more efficient, ultimately.
Yes, more efficient, more precise intelligence, and I think that, as you look at these technologies, the defenders are they're going to have to keep pace with the threats, and these technologies are going to give them an advantage to be able to do that.
So, Justin, you and I had a fascinating conversation before this panel about the human element to all of this, right? We talk about, computers and AI and all this stuff kind of taking over all these human endeavors. But one of your concerns is that these systems make companies, the government, more vulnerable to human intelligence operatives, that they're going to be more kind of foreign operatives finding their way into American companies and stealing their data. Tell us about that concern.
I don't think it's necessarily AI specific, but just if you look at the geopolitical space we're in right now, you could argue we're heading into a new era of a new Cold War, and I think you're going to see more counter-espionage happening throughout. As was mentioned, AI is a great tool for that, probably one of the best in my opinions, because someone who's spying or changing their daily routine, it is hard to spot. But you can spot that traffic, or AI can spot that traffic in a mess of logs and data. Something as simple as I come in and badge in just a little bit later every morning because I'm going and meeting my handler beforehand. Or I'm printing out more than I typically have printed out in the past. Like, there are certain behaviors that we could spot very easily with it.
So if you're an individual or a company, given all of these, the promise and peril, let's talk about the peril for a second. What lesson should someone in the audience here take away, as an individual or as someone kind of running or involved in running a company, take from how to manage these risks that we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes? What's the number one or two thing that people need to think about how to manage their own data, privacy, risk of infiltration? John.
I think that the one thing I would emphasize is keep up. This is a very fast-moving dynamic. And it's going, in my opinion, this is going to change things dramatically. It's already having that effect. So keep up, no matter what your profession is, business, journalism, it doesn't matter. Keep up with what's happening in this arena, because it's going to affect everything we do. AI is going to affect everything from flight control to transportation optimization to you name it. Cybersecurity is obviously one of the big ones as well.
We only have 30 seconds, and it's totally unfair for me to ask this question, but I want to. So you've been in a world where you've been working with AI, as you say, for decades already, for a decade or more. What do you see about how it changes the nature of work itself? I mean, it obviously hasn't replaced work in your industry. People are still doing it, but the way you function has changed. So I'm going to take a liberty and take a little extra time. How does work more broadly across the economy change with these additive tools?
I think from my end, from the defender end, we're concerned about it being abused, as was mentioned earlier, from the inside. So how are our workers using it? Do we have a handle on that? Do we have policies in place for the acceptable, appropriate use of it so that sensitive data is not getting leaked? I think there needs to be more focus on that right now.
Well, so that raises two questions. One is, who do you hire? Who do you allow into the box? But then the other is that worker's privacy and like what you're tracking for them. Give me a 15-second answer on how work itself changes with.
I agree with Justin.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please welcome Janet Rathod, Global Head of Cyber Threat Intelligence for Citigroup, and Karan Sandhi, CTO Public Sector at Trellix. Semafor Senior Editor Gina Chon returns to the stage to moderate this conversation.
Hi, Janet and Karan. Thank you so much for being with us. We're here to talk about the threat landscape and, frankly, how bad it has gotten given all of the various hacks we've seen, even just over the last year. Companies and individuals are dealing with both nation states like Russia and China, North Korea, Iran, and then obviously there's a lot of criminal gangs running rampant and making a lot of money from these attacks. So I wanted to start off with just kind of an overview from both of you, especially for Janet, since you're coming from Citigroup, looking at the financial sector. What is the landscape of threats now, and do you feel like it's worse now than it was even just a year ago?
Ooh, good question. So you want me to focus on cyber criminals or nation-state actors? Where should we start?
Because we're dealing with both, and sometimes they work together, where the criminal goes in, gets what he wants, and then sells whatever to the nation state. I mean, we're dealing with a whole host of bad actors here.
Yes, it is so true. So I think on the cybercrime front, it is rampant. We are seeing attacks across all industries, and we are seeing the techniques just evolve so rapidly. One thing that we're seeing recently in the threat landscape is it used to be that a threat actor would go into a system, break in, and then lock up your systems. Now we're seeing tradecraft where they're not even bothering to deploy malware. So they will get in, steal your data, get out, and extort you that way. We're also seeing multiple levels of extortion. We're seeing people pay ransom, and then the cyber criminals not even coming through with what they say. So they say, we're going to give you back your data. We say we're going to unlock your systems, and then they don't.
So you've paid, and then you don't even get anything in return, and so you're in worse shape.
Exactly. The other key piece is just how professional it's become. So if we look at, let's take an example. If we look at the healthcare profession, and you've got your cardiologist, and you've got your ophthalmologist, within the cybercrime ecosystem, you have such specialization. You might have one group or one individual who is solely focused on just getting access into a system. They don't necessarily care about deploying the malware. They don't care about getting the data and stealing it, but they are just 100% focused on getting into, providing access into the system. So you'll see these different levels of professionalization. So that is what we're seeing on the cybercrime front. On the nation-state side, it is very focused on evading detection. So one of the new techniques that we were just talking about, living off the land. So essentially you get into the system and you use the tools that are indigenous within the system to essentially stay alive and maintain persistence. We are also seeing on the nation-state front the furtherance of geopolitical objectives. So think your traditional espionage, where if you were in the intelligence community, you're thinking about human operations. Now we're seeing this rapid evolution of so much espionage. Stealing secrets, stealing information, and again, we're talking every vertical and every industry.
And Janet, for those of you who don't know, came after years being at the FBI and then moving into the private sector. But for those nation-state actors, do they even have to exfiltrate the data? Because if they're trying to evade detection, can they just copy it or do something else where you don't even know that they were there?
It is going to depend on what their objectives are. So are they in your system to stay there and then potentially activate when needed? So they may just want to stay inside of your system. If they want to steal secrets, they will employ a variety of different techniques.
Great, and Karan, from your perspective at Trellix, focusing on the public sector, how bad do you see the threat landscape, particularly, this angle that Janet was talking about, where nation-state actors, before you were saying in the green room, like they actually didn't care. China didn't care if you knew they were there, and now that has totally changed.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm surprised everybody's still using their laptops and phones. I mean, look, China's in your phones, right? Russia's in there. It looks all doom and gloom, and you guys want to throw that phone and laptop out the window, I'm sure. But look, the reality is things are changing as times are changing, right? So what's happened before, if you look at the early 2000s, China really, quite frankly, didn't care, kind of like how you articulated it. They wanted to come in, they wanted to steal the IP, or they wanted to grab whatever data they could. Over time, they had to manage optics, and they had to also make sure that they look like a professional organization in front of everyone's eyes. So you've seen a lot more cleanup in their cyber activities. They're way more clandestine, almost mimicking what's happening with Russia. And if you're looking at the two countries saying, they're collaborating a lot, there's a lot of synergies between the two, well, of course, right? That's a natural syndication that's happening where Russia's telling you, hey, you maybe don't want everybody to know about your cyber activities, because that's been their go-to tradecraft. They would, you have to think in their mindset. Russian actors would rather lose their capabilities to be able to conduct cyber operation than actually have it attributed to them. So they would rather do nothing, or at worst, just say, hey, let's just let it go. We don't want people to know that we were involved in this activity. Whereas China, back in the day, didn't care. Now they realize that there are repercussions. There's going to be a lot more scrutiny put on the country. The way the country is going to get looked at globally will change. So they want very little attribution. What's kind of concerning a little bit more, I think, is it's becoming harder to discern who the nation-state actors are that are actually involved in some of this cybercrime activity. They've become better at false flags, where it would indicate that, hey, it looks like it's a criminal gang. They might deploy ransomware, try to make it appear as though it was financially incentivized, when in fact it was a nation-state-backed activity. Ransomware is probably not the best example of this, but you'll see a lot of things in the public domain where it wasn't 100% clear if it was China or Russia, or if it was a crime syndicate that was actually going after this data, because their activities, basically their tradecraft and activities mimic each other. At the end of the day, if you're on the defensive side, right, you don't really care about the actor. You want to do the attribution, just like Janet mentioned, just so you know who might be evolving in their sophistication. But at the end of the day, you want to basically focus more on, hey, what are some basic capabilities to protect you?
So Janet, given that threat landscape, why do you think we haven't seen a debilitating attack that caused some sort of panic among citizens at a major corporation? We were talking a bit ago about the Sony hack, and that was years ago, and that's really the last one that I could think where a company really could not function for days until they were able to figure out how to live without, basically being online. But they couldn't pay people. It was a huge mess. We were talking earlier about the United Healthcare attack. Is it just that, they just haven't gotten lucky?
I think there's a couple of questions that we would want to ask when dissecting that question. So what would be the motivation? What would be the motivation of either a nation-state actor or a cyber criminal to inflict that level of mayhem and pain upon the United States, the most powerful country? There's this concept, if you thinking back to our studies on nuclear weapons, where we had this concept of mutually assured destruction. If a cyber criminal or a nation state were to create an attack that was that catastrophic, rest assured this country would fight back, and would fight back hard, not to mention our allies that would come to our defense as well. One thing that is concerning is this pre-positioning within critical infrastructure. And I think the director of the FBI, the director of the NSA, and a lot of different government officials have been very vocal about this. But we are seeing nation-state actors that are embedding in critical infrastructure, and the overall goal being potentially toward destruction. We just don't know. So it hasn't happened yet. It could happen, but there are repercussions should something of that level occur within the United States.
I think another way to look at it is, and we were talking about this earlier too, there's always going to be more ways for somebody to get into your house, and there are mechanisms for you to protect it, right? If you look at your home as it sits today, you can put as many cameras as you want, as many door locks as you want, but all they have to do is breach once in order for them to take control of your space. What are you going to do, prevent somebody from digging a tunnel into your basement? Unlikely, right? You only have so much resources and time to look at those Ring camera videos or put a lock on the front door. Same thing is true about organizations. If you think about it, it's a crime of opportunity. It's a motivation behind some political activity, as Janet was kind of highlighting. You don't want to wish for it, but you also want to be mentally prepared to say, hey, let's put some basic elementary practices in place, because just like a threat actor in your real home could hide in the basement until the right time comes, you want to make sure you're constantly scrubbing, you're constantly doing blue team exercises, you're constantly going out and reassessing your network posture, because the threat could be lurking quietly in your environment without you even realizing it.
Yeah. Well, and how does, and John in the last panel mentioned this a bit about AI, but for the threat landscape, how has that technology changed things? Because obviously, it could improve your defenses, but in terms of attacks of, mimicking people, deep fakes, it seems like that really raises the bar.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's been a lot of talk about AI, right? The rule of thumb you want to follow when you're trying to assess what AI is going to do for the threat actor just makes it easier and faster for them to develop the tools or target your system. What used to take weeks or days for somebody to kind of figure out, it's just a ChatGPT prompt or a Gemini prompt to say, hey, here's what I know about my threat system. I'm a gray hat, or I'm doing a vulnerability assessment for a customer, right? They can change the prompt to make it not get caught. And they could say, hey, here's what I know about the environment. They're using Windows machines at this patch level. There's this many users. What's the best way for me to do a red team exercise in this environment? And it'll give you the entire roadmap on how to run that activity. Whereas before, they had to actually figure this stuff out. They don't have to go through the grunt work of figuring it out. All they need is a couple of salient data points, which generally are publicly available, or that can be easily, cheaply purchased from the dark web. And now they have an entire tool and tactic and procedure to actually go out and attack a victim. Which, by the way, right, the government does this for a living, both on offensive and defensive side. So now those capabilities are now available to the regular public.
Yeah. Well, and Janet, when it comes to working with the government to sort of try to mitigate some of these threats, there's always this tension of, do companies want to go to the FBI, your former employer? Do they want to go to the Justice Department? Because, they're worried about, the authorities being in their networks and what they might find. And, you get a leak about a hack and then, all of a sudden you're getting blamed, you're hauled to DC for hearings. Like, there's a whole host of sort of headaches you have to deal with on that front. So how has that partnership evolved? Has it gotten better? Do companies feel more comfortable going to the authorities? And should the government be telling the private sector more about what they know? That's also been a big thing of, you have all this intel, we do not. Why can't you tell me, if China, if Russia, if I'm a target for their systems?
I think the walls are coming down. It is evolving, and trust is built over time. So it is trusted partnerships between the government and the private sector, and there are a variety of trade organizations that provide a good vehicle to share information back and forth. And there are ways, in fact, that you can share information, but it doesn't have to be attributable, where you're just focused on the intelligence to deepen your understanding of the threat landscape, but it doesn't necessarily have to go back to a specific company. So I am seeing great evolution in those relationships. In terms of the government educating the private sector, as I transitioned from the FBI to private industry, I was incredibly surprised at the amount of information, the amount of telemetry, the amount of analysis that resides within the private sector. So I would say it's not necessarily about the government providing intelligence to the private sector, but it is a two-way street of information sharing, where one entity may have gaps, another entity may have gaps, and you bring those two things together. Some of the big vendors, so if I'm an incident response firm, the amount of telemetry that I have that is focused on, say, ransomware attacks, that is a differentiator, and that goes to our understanding as a community of the threat landscape.
And Karan, do you think enough is being done on that front?
So yes, I think so, right? I talk often about CISA's JCDC program, Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And by the way, whenever I use that acronym, somebody in the back always says, ACDC, like Highway to Hell? It's like, no, wrong.
Not quite.
Wrong acronym. But there's an opportunity to mimic what Australia does. So I was fortunate where I had an opportunity to work with one of our 5i partners in Australia and in my capacity here at Trellix. And in Australia, they actually have a program where you will be shielded from any liability if you come to the government and share that you've been either breached or there was a vulnerability. And not only that, they will actually provide government sourced either employees or contractors where they will provide the resources, tools, people, and techniques to actually remediate your environment. So if you're a bank, healthcare institution, or even a small mom and pop shop, they will provide you the resources to remediate, because they figure that as a country and as a culture, it's important to actually fix the problem instead of punishing them. And I think that attitude, if I could use that strong word, is the right way to look at it. Whereas here in the United States, there's still a risk, right? And I'm not trying to penalize the SEC. I understand where their optics are around going after CISOs who don't do disclosures, but there has to also be a carrot from the government to say, hey, we want you to come forward, we want you to disclose some of these things in a private setting, and we're going to provide you immunity from any kind of liability because you came forward, because you have a lot of sensitive data about customers and their bank accounts or healthcare records that we want to actually protect. And I don't think we quite have that legislative framework here.
Not victimizing the victim, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, we'll see if the U.S. takes a look at that framework. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Please welcome Jeanette Mantra, Director, Risk and Compliance for Google Cloud, and Push M. Kumar, Director, Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response at the U.S. Department of Energy. Semafor Senior Editor Gina Chan remains on stage to moderate this conversation.
Hi. Thank you so much to both of you for being here. Especially for such an important topic, given what we see going on in the world with critical infrastructure. And I wanted to start off with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. because that was something where the possible attacks on critical infrastructure was, really a top of mind, whether it was their energy systems, their connections to get online were all a risk. And we saw the cyber attack on Viasat that targeted, their online capabilities and their energy grid systems and other critical infrastructure. What did that teach us about, how vulnerable these systems are? What could be the solutions for mitigating them? Especially for you, Poosh, being in the energy department, were there any lessons learned from that?
That's a great question, and thanks for having me. And yeah, let's just jump right into
yes.
it, right? It is
yes,
quite the
talk
question.
about Ukraine.
It's something that we're still seeing unfold. Unfortunately, this really horrific invasion by Russia into Ukraine. Early on when this was happening, a lot of us were concerned that cyber was going to be what we were going to see, and then some of the kinetic attacks were going to come later. And when folks didn't see that as much, people were wondering what happened here.
Yeah.
And I got that question. I got that question within the department. I know across the interagency industry. One thing I like to remind people is, one, what we saw was some of their cyber defenses worked. It's not that Russia did not conduct cyber attacks. They did try. But the fact that Ukraine had invested in cyber defense, particularly after the 2015 and 2016 events, when there were power outages as a result of cyber attacks, shows you the value in defense. And so that's number one, they did have defense. Number two, what we saw was there was a global effort to support Ukraine. There was this, what we call operational collaboration. It was private sector companies, it was governments, it was Microsoft, it was the US government, other governments all coming together. And so that's another value, is how we need to really defend our systems is through some of that collaboration as industry and government. And then the third for me was, we might have to start thinking of cyber because of its impact to critical infrastructure, to operations of critical infrastructure like electricity or oil and natural gas. We also saw that Ukraine was able to get things back up and running quickly. So if there was an incident, whether cyber or even kinetic, the resilience that was inherent in their system kept them going, is keeping them going today. So we need to continue investing in hardening our systems, assuming compromise, and just investing in resilience. So those are three big things, as really thinking how we think about the grid and energy infrastructure, critical infrastructure broadly.
Yeah. And Jeanette, what about for you, especially because you guys are seeing, across multiple different industries and have a global perspective, what are some of the lessons learned from some of the recent events?
Yeah. Well, Push covered it all pretty well. I think the things I would add is the additional investments that the Ukrainian government had made in modernizing their technology. And so, I've been working in cloud the last few years, so I have that perspective at the moment. But the fact that they had actually migrated a lot to cloud allowed them to have more resilience, to be able to rely on capabilities that the Russians were not able to disrupt. Now that doesn't apply kind of holistically to the various critical infrastructure sectors just yet in Ukraine, but we did see that that investment paid off. But also the investment in the training, the investment in the better defenses, the investments that kind of all companies, the operational collaboration that Push mentioned, people really coming together, not just to help with technology, but to help with the training and with people and resources. Some of the other things, kind of stepping outside of the Ukrainian experience directly, but some of the other things we learned is the tangled supply chain, right? And when you have these disruptions, there are suddenly realization that I need to be able to pivot, whether that's rare minerals that you need to be, that you're dependent on, or different companies that have, integrated in ways that you didn't understand. So it did really, I think, force a lot of companies in the US and in Europe to think about that supply chain as well.
Yeah. And what about the cloud providers themselves? Because they are also critical infrastructure. How have you guys rethought your defenses, resiliency, getting the systems back up if there is a meltdown somewhere? How has your thinking changed on that front?
Yeah, I think cloud, particularly hyperscalers that have built just a mind-boggling scope of infrastructure over decades, have learned how to build that level of reliability into their systems in a way and at an expense that is difficult for other smaller organizations. And so when I think about cloud, and one of the reasons that I joined Google after I left government is there's tremendous opportunity. And as critical infrastructure and other organizations make that migration, because of that scale, that economies of scale that in particular hyperscalers have, they can invest in the security, the reliability, the recovery, and they can make security cheaper and easier for their customers in a way that it doesn't currently exist. So there's huge opportunity to leverage that scale and to drive cloud providers to increase that level of security and safety and reliability is I think, very critical. And I do believe it is a responsibility of cloud providers, particularly the largest ones, who are increasingly serving more and more critical infrastructure sectors, to have that high bar of security and safety. But there's also risk, because you start to consolidate on just a few companies. Yeah. And so you have to think about, what does that mean, that concentration risk. So you have to sort of think from a policy perspective of how you both leverage that opportunity while also managing that potential concentration risk.
Well, and if we could talk a bit more about the resiliency of the electricity grids, because we're all here and, thankfully in air conditioning, but the outside, it's 90 some degrees. Like, the country is experiencing, record heat this week. And that's even aside from, possible attackers and people looking for vulnerabilities in the system. So in terms of our electricity infrastructure, how does that exacerbate the possible problems of protecting the system when you're just dealing with sort of aging infrastructure and high demand? We have AI causing a surge as well for energy resources, and just a lot of pressure already on the system.
Right. So my office is looking at all risks to U.S. energy systems. It's certainly cyber is a really big one, but the reality is we're also looking at climate-based risks, physical security. It's really across the board. Right now we're going through tremendous change in the sector. We're trying to combat the climate risk. We're trying to deploy more clean energy. We're trying to deploy more renewables and electric vehicles, and all of that's really great. And that can be a source of resilience in our energy sector in the United States. It could bring online more generation that hasn't been online into our grid. But we also have to do that with security in mind. And so as we're fundamentally changing this grid, we have to ensure that security is baked into it. What I like to tell people is, we've been bolting on security to that traditional grid, but we can really change that and say, if we're deploying new solar and wind, it will come with cyber requirements. And so we have an opportunity, and if we don't take that opportunity and actually do something about it, I feel like 10 years from now, we're going to say, why didn't we? To the cloud comment, a lot of that clean energy is actually going into the cloud first. A lot of the traditional large fossil generation is actually not in the cloud because of regulations that do not allow it to be in the cloud, whereas a lot of the clean energy doesn't have those regulations. So because it's cheaper, it's more efficient, it's more reliable, they're all going into the cloud, but really we haven't really sat down to define what are the security requirements. Who owns what part of the security picture? Is it the owner and operator, or is it the cloud service provider? So one of the big efforts that we're going to be undertaking this year is really bringing together companies like Jeanette's to actually come together and establish those requirements for both sides so that we can set up the energy sector of the future with that security built in. So that's kind of our goal, because that's going to help with resiliency and it's going to help with security.
And speaking of lessons learned, whether it's Ukraine or we were talking earlier about the United Healthcare attack, I also wanted to go back to the Colonial Pipeline hack, because even though that now seems like, another lifetime, that did cause, serious problems in the country and became, a political problem as well because of what it did to gas prices. What were the lessons learned in that where, I don't know if the Colonial company was sort of at the top of anyone's list for a target as a hack, but obviously it became a big deal. And what did the department learn from that?
Yeah, we were in the thick of it, working with our colleagues at CISA and the FBI, really leading some of that response. So there's a lot there. One of the big things I like to remind people about the Colonial incident is it was not a nation state that did that. It was a criminal group. If a criminal group could impact the IT systems, again, the adversary didn't go into the OT systems. The criminal group was just on the IT systems. But even an IT attack caused operational impact to a supercritical pipeline that we rely on for oil, for jet fuel, for gasoline. And so if they could do that, again, not a sophisticated attacker, what could a nation state have done? And so as we're continuing to see Russian activists conducting cyber attacks on infrastructure in the United States, we co-sealed a project recently with our colleagues at CISA and FBI on this. You would expect to see nation states are learning from this and saying, we can cause societal impact by not using sophisticated cyber attacks. So we have to raise the bar, right? So the where we are right now is if the cyber hacktivist groups, the criminal groups, are at this level, if we're here, that's not a good place to be. We still need to stay a step above those hackers. And so that's where we're going to be pushing on cyber baselines. We need cyber baselines for critical infrastructure. The new National Security Memorandum that the President issued a couple weeks ago says that. So we're actually working pretty aggressively to say, what are those base level expectations for infrastructure? And then beyond that, we need to continue doing more. So the other thing from Colonial is we need CEO level buy-in. We need, and the CEO of Colonial testified. So from our sector, electricity sector, we have CEOs coming to the table. We need that in oil and natural gas. We need that in water. We need that in cloud service providers, where CEOs are engaged, not only with their companies in some of these decisions, but also with the government.
Yeah, it's not just at a CISO level.
It has to be at the highest level if we're truly going to make some impact.
Yeah.
If I could just add one thing about the Colonial Pipeline that I think is really important is the consequences around perception and loss of trust, right? It wasn't any sort of cyber incident that caused fuel shortages. It was an increasing panic and a loss of trust in the system. And if you think about it, with all these critical infrastructure sectors, right? You've got energy, you've got finance, you've got water. They all have some element of needing to have the population trust that these services are going to be available to them. And so I think making sure that we don't lose sight of that importance of maintaining that trust, I think, is really critical.
And Jeanette, before we go, we're out of time, but I wanted to get your thoughts on how should we even think of what is critical infrastructure? Because I think, the electricity grid and things like that are kind of obvious to us, but, the New York Stock Exchange, there are other things that could cause sort of panic among investors, panic among citizens. How broadly should we be thinking about this category?
Well, the way that, and one of the things I'm most proud of at CISA is changing the conversation a little bit to about national critical functions, because it's the service and the function that happens to be provided by some specific sectors, but by thinking about it as the service or the function, the generation of electricity, right? You can start to go through and understand what elements within the industry are critical to ensuring that service continues. And the same with the financial sector. I think we can learn a lot from lessons around financial stability, even nothing to do with cyber, but just thinking about how you maintain the stability of these critical services and function, and then orienting the government to be monitoring and looking for anything that might cause that. And that also allows us to think a little bit more than just a very technical aspect of it, but most actors that are going to seek to undermine trust in our systems are going to come at it from a very sort of combined way.
Yeah. So we just have to try to stay ahead of that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. Well, hopefully these are good lessons learned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome Ann Neuberger, Deputy White House National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology. Semafor Deputy Washington Bureau Chief Morgan Chalfant returns to the stage to moderate this conversation.
Anne, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to be worried about what you're spending most of your time on and doing about in terms of threats.
Absolutely. So first, it's great to be here. This must be the coolest building in DC. It has just a really nice vibe, so it's great to be here. So with regard to threat landscapes, we really see rising threats from countries and criminals alike, and the advent of AI just adds some additional spice into the mix. So on the country side, certainly see Chinese prepositioning of critical infrastructure. We've had surge efforts working with various sectors of critical infrastructure to focus on that, working with our international partners, because we see China's focus on disrupting critical infrastructure in the case of a crisis as something that not only affects us, but our key Indo-Pacific allies and partners as well. In the Russia context, Russia's really created a much more permissive environment for both ransomware attackers, financially driven, but we see their disruptive impact across hospitals, schools, and companies, as well as hacktivists, politically aligned with the Russian government. And Russia continues to be a disruptive force, both in intelligence collection, and you've seen several European countries, outline their concerns regarding Russian cyber activity. The North Koreans continue to use hacks of crypto infrastructure, exploiting software vulnerabilities as a key way to get around sanctions and raise money. That's a big focus for us in working with crypto infrastructure around the world. A shout out to the recent crypto ISAC that stood up to help companies focus on sharing threat information amongst themselves to counter and work on that. And finally, Iran continues to be a spoiler, both in the region and just an aggressive behavior on disinformation as well. So that's how we look at the landscape from both countries and criminals in terms of rising threats.
And I do want to get to critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, but I do want to pick up on China's cyber threat because you mentioned it. I noticed that the G7 statement that was released last week mentioned specifically, calling out China as aggressive in cyberspace. Are you seeing, I guess, how would you describe what you're seeing? Is it kind of growing, the activity, and kind of why the decision to include that in the statement?
Absolutely, and then I'm going to highlight one other deliverable in the G statement related to cybersecurity. So countries across Europe have really put more of a focus on both Chinese investment in critical infrastructure, notably in telecom networks. You saw the European Union really raise the level of their guidance and concerns related to Chinese companies in telecom networks because the nation's secrets, the nation's intellectual property rides on telecom, and the Chinese government has explicit policies that they can go to any Chinese company and request data, and that's why there's a real concern on telecom. But also a recognition that China is really playing a role helping Russia in its war in Ukraine, and concerns regarding that role, regarding its making available dual-use technologies that's really allowing Russia's military to make the continued advancements to rebuild its defense industrial base. So more of a recognition by Europe, both for its own national security as well as concerns regarding regarding China's role assisting Russia in the ongoing war in Ukraine.
And you mentioned there was another issue you wanted to highlight. So what else did you see as kind of major coming out of G7?
Absolutely. So energy infrastructure is core to our countries. And we see both rising threats from China and Russia, as well as rising ransomware threats. And there's a lot more digitalization that will come with the growth of clean energy, integrating new technologies to manage the load, potentially the role of AI in being used to identify preventive maintenance from a load balancing perspective. And there's a small number of companies, largely European, US, and Japanese, that really build the technologies around operational technology managing energy networks. And operational technology is really the core of energy networks on, off, and global operations. So we work closely with the other G7 countries as well as the set of 8 companies to get agreements to implement cybersecurity principles. The American companies committed to the actual principles. A shout out to Piyush, who was just here a moment ago, and the fantastic team at the Department of Energy and Idaho National Labs. And so that was in the G7 deliverable. You'll see shortly further announcements in terms of the actual companies talking about their commitments. And we'll be hosting a second phase, at the White House, bringing both our G7 partners together and the set of 8 companies, sharing threat intelligence and doubling down on how companies will implement these cybersecurity principles so that operational technology systems in energy companies around the world are secure enough to meet the growing threat.
And one issue that we've touched on in a few of our panels today has been cybersecurity of the healthcare sector. Obviously, there's a lot of concern around ransomware attacks there. What's next for the White House there? I know that you're looking at some kind of rules for the industry. When are we going to see those? What are they going to look like? Can you give us a sense of kind of the sausage making there?
So we've seen attacks on hospitals and healthcare systems, notably by Russia-based ransomware attackers. So financially driven rise dramatically. I think they're up 130% in the last few months. In the UK today, they're grappling with a very difficult ransomware attack on a healthcare-related company. And with all of these rising attacks, there's an us and a them aspect. And the us aspect is, how do we ensure that targets of those attacks are as secure as they need to be? The hospital and healthcare sector continuously ranks as one of the most vulnerable. After COVID, it was a difficult time. More systems were rolled in, and it was just, so hospitals really do need to focus and double down on cybersecurity. We hosted an event at the White House in the last couple of weeks, really bringing together leaders, cybersecurity leaders across the sector to brainstorm with them. What are the policies that government needs to put in place? What are the policies that are burdensome that we can do better about? And you saw the White House rolled out in partnership with Microsoft and Google a program of free training and cybersecurity tech for the nation's 1,800 rural hospitals. The hospitals that really are the only ones for the surrounding area. So if they're hit by a cyber attack, Americans don't have access to healthcare. And that's really been a priority for the president, making sure that that's not disrupted. So you'll be seeing is in the next, we're working on a rule related to minimum cybersecurity practices for hospitals. We've been working closely with the American Hospital Association to get input from the sector, and you'll see that, we're working on that in the next few weeks.
Great. We've talked about energy infrastructure, we've talked about healthcare sector. What other critical infrastructure do you think is particularly vulnerable to cyber sabotage at this point that you're worried about?
The sectors where we're particularly concerned are those that our military relies on to deploy. So for example, you saw the White House, President Biden's focus on port security, because clearly when our military deploys, and certainly from an economic perspective, goods come back and forth in through our ports. So we need to have confidence that our ports are cyber secure, and indeed, the Coast Guard was given additional authorities to set those maritime security standards, and the Department of Homeland Security issued a rule to get public input on what those cybersecurity standards should be. Similarly, we've put in place new minimum cybersecurity requirements for airports, for airlines, for railways, because they transport people, most importantly, and goods and materials as well. So we focused all across critical infrastructure, but put a particular focus on hospitals, water, rail, aviation, and ports as being core to the economy and core to our military's deployment. In fact, I would just note that in Japan, they had a major ransomware attack against the port of Nagoya. That's the core port that Toyota uses to export cars. It had a massive financial impact, even just being down for 2 days. And I think we know that both criminals and countries know that. And as a result, we've got to make sure that the security of those networks are up to snuff. And it's been, as a country, it's been a pretty bipartisan issue, a recognition that locking our digital doors really crosses all aisles.
And obviously we have, the White House is grappling with these conflicts, in Ukraine and Gaza. How are those ongoing wars impacting the work you do? Do you see more activity from Russia, from Iran? Are you seeing it change kind of the landscape, or are you, doing things you would normally be doing if we weren't grappling with these wars overseas?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen both rising cyber attacks, rising disinformation, both regionally in the Middle East, as well as countries planning as part of their broader, geopolitical goals to use cyber a part of that. It's no surprise, for example, that the evening before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they conducted a cyber attack on an American satellite company that was the core provider of communications for Ukraine's military. Countries now really look at the digital space as a core part of their espionage and their attacks to achieve their national goals. Disinformation is a particular concern by foreign governments, notably, because of that, because public support for a country, the internal cohesion within a country is core to the country's strength as well.
And we often see cyber actors plan operations, attacks around big events. The Olympics is coming up in France. Is the U.S. doing anything to help the French prepare for potential cyber attacks? I know there's been some chatter about the Russians planning or, potentially doing things. What are you doing around that?
At every major event, whether it's a major sporting event, whether it's something like the Olympics, an international event, countries around the world turn to the United States, both to ask for advice, to ask for support, and to ensure that we're also providing intelligence support. Much as we provide that support for physical space, will there be a physical attack? We provide in a digital space. As you know, there's been a previous history of aggressive Russian cyber attacks against Olympics. It's certainly a focus. I spoke with my French counterparts just a few weeks ago. They're working actively, both intelligence partnership as well as partnership between our national cyber defense agencies to ensure that this can be a safe and secure Olympics.
Is there anything specific that you're expecting or that you have information about potentially happening, or at this point just kind of still planning stages?
Not at this time. At this time we've been focused on ensuring the monitoring is in place of networks so that if there is any anomalous activity or if there is something that looks suspicious, it can be blocked quickly. The intelligence is focused on the actors who in the past have been causes of concern, and then that we've stood up the partnerships, right? People turn over and you've got to make sure that the right people know who to call, and you've exercised that well before an incident happens. Really, the exercising before an incident is core to rapid response. People know who to call, people know what to look for, people know what support is ready, it's pre-positioned as needed, and that's a big part of what we've all put in place in the last few weeks.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about is undersea cables, because the Wall Street Journal recently reported that the U.S. had been warning telecom companies about undersea cables potentially being vulnerable to Chinese espionage. Can you talk about the work the White House is doing here? How worried are you about this kind of activity?
So then international communications really rides on undersea cables. There's more and more of those communications, and U.S. companies are global leaders in that. In fact, you may have seen during the recent Kenya state visit, Google announced some major new cables, both intra-Africa, between Africa and Australia, and that's core to digitalization. Countries really put a focus on those cables because they know that with that comes industry. With that comes opportunity for their citizens. And as such, the security of those cables are a priority. We've both had an international effort on resilience of cables. Do we have enough cables? Are they taking enough independent routes? Are areas that are conflict prone? Are we ensuring that we have alternative paths for cables? So that's been a strategic conversation. There's been a NATO focus on resilience of undersea cables as well. And in the Quad context, we're having a discussion around both how to ensure that we're working with the private sector to ensure the resilience of undersea cables, both to cable cuts, as well as to intentional cutting of cables potentially.
And you mentioned AI earlier. I wanted to follow up on that because this is something I write about a lot and focus on a lot. Everyone's really focused on AI. How is that changing your work, and how do you weigh the benefits and drawbacks to AI to cybersecurity? Do you see it as sort of a net benefit or a net risk? How do you kind of assess that?
We often talk about AI as a dual-use technology, and I must say, in the context of cybersecurity, that really rings true. Because as we look at cybersecurity, two parts there. One, generating more secure code. Not just more code, which you see in like Copilot today, but actually more secure code and testing code and finding vulnerabilities. There's a lot of promise of AI. In fact, we launched, as part of the President's executive order, he launched 2 pilots, both at DHS and the Department of Defense, to consider how one does that. In the context of cybersecurity, today a lot of cybersecurity is looking for anomalous activity based on what we've seen before, and that's important. Imagine if we can also predict what are the kinds of attacks, and frankly look for those kinds of new anomalies that we haven't necessarily seen before, as well as reduce the amount of time an attacker's on a network. Because in many cases, it's very, very difficult to prevent an attack. The key is how quickly can you catch it, and how is the network designed to actually prevent the attacker from moving quickly. So if we can use AI to detect an anomaly quickly, get people looking at it, and reduce the amount of time an attacker's in a network as well, hugely promising. So there's a number of efforts in that space. As we talk to VCs, as we talk to the private sector, and they say, what do you need? We say, really, please think about how to use AI in the areas I just talked about. On the offensive side, AI also offers a great deal of promise. The same AI model that can look for vulnerabilities to help us close them and patch them can also be used to help build exploits. So the key for us is to really use AI for defense in our cybersecurity as quickly as we see attackers, and that's both countries and criminals, using AI on the offensive side. A lot of what we're still seeing on AI on the offensive side is things like building more focused spear phishing emails for the individual who's receiving them, but we expect that to grow.
Anne, thank you so much for your time today, and really appreciate our audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You covered a ton of ground.
Please welcome back to the stage Semafor CEO and co-founder Justin B. Smith.
All right, thank you so much. We are at the end of our program. I just want to say a big thank you to our audience for staying here. And so many people so engaged, taking notes, hopefully writing articles, tweeting, etc. Thank you so much for coming. And a big thank you to our partners at Verizon Business and Chris Novak, who made today possible. Please mark your calendars. We'll be here again in just a few weeks on July 10th. With a new event on banking on the future, the next era of fintech. If those of you are interested, please join us. And with that, thank you. Have a wonderful day. Hope you can bear the heat outside. Thank you so much.